At the end of 2023, a forecast by the International Monetary Fund sent shockwaves across Europe. Italy was on the verge of surpassing France in per capita wealth. This isn't just a statistic. It's proof that an economic gap once thought impossible to close has almost disappeared. And that raises an unavoidable question. How did one of Europe's most powerful economic engines come to such a deep standstill? But this economic decline is only the first symptom of a more complex illness. An illness that manifests in the spiral of increasingly widespread and violent crime, and whose ultimate cause lies in a deadlocked political system, incapable of producing solutions. In this video in the Inside Your Country series, we go beyond the day's headlines to reveal the three structural fractures, economic, social, and political, that have brought France to the brink of an unprecedented crisis. Welcome to Amazing Europe. 60%. It's not just any statistic. It's the measure of a fracture that splits French society. 60% of French people fear living worse than their parents. We're not talking about irrational fear, but the end of a promise. That of the guaranteed post-war progress. Numbers don't lie. 16% of jobs today are precarious, especially those with fixed-term contracts and apprenticeships. For some countries, that may not seem like a high number, but bear in mind that it has more than doubled compared to the 1980s. As we said before, young people are worse off than their parents. But beware, parents aren't doing any better either. Pensions? Yes, increases are planned, but they are negligible, unable to offset the real inflation on essential goods. Job stability? Gone. Real wages? Stagnant. Cost of living? Through the roof. The middle class, once the backbone of France, is crumbling. This is not only a GDP crisis, but a crisis of the real purchasing power of families. How much does it cost to live in France today? If you look only at the official statistics, France seems to have tamed the monster of inflation. The figure is almost textbook, plus 1.2% in September 2025, a number that suggests a return to normality. But this figure is a statistical illusion, built on a profound paradox. The drop in inflation has been driven almost entirely by the price of energy, which, to be fair, has decreased, but only compared to the unsustainably high peaks of the recent crisis. If we widen our view to the last decade, the truth is different. Since 2015, the price of electricity for a French citizen has risen by about 60%. Over the same period, average wages have grown by only 25%. Energy has therefore increased at twice the speed, devouring an ever larger share of household income. Inflation has also hit the supermarket, causing a silent revolution in consumption. Today, for the majority of French people, price has become the decisive factor in 7 purchases out of 10. People fill their carts less, cutting back especially on meat and organic products. It's a two-pronged squeeze. On one hand, a shopping cart that remains stubbornly expensive. On the other, energy bills that, despite fluctuations, are structurally heavier than before. For millions of French people, the struggle to make ends meet is no longer a temporary emergency, but the new, poorer economic normality. The anxiety of the French consumer, their daily struggle with prices, is not the disease, but the symptom of something deeper and structural. The real illness of this nation lies at the very heart of France's economic machine, its productive engine. Over the past 20 years, the country has witnessed a steady hollowing out of its industrial base. The share of manufacturing, once a source of national pride, has fallen from over 16% of GDP to around 10% today. For comparison, neighbouring Germany has maintained a solid industrial base of more than 20% over the same period. This is not an abstract statistic. It has translated into nearly 2 million industrial jobs lost, the economic desertification of entire regions, and a deep wound in the trade balance. The bitter truth is this: France is no longer betting on its own industry, steadily cutting back on production. But there's a striking paradox here. The country imports far more goods than it exports. This gap creates a €164 billion hole. In practice, far more money leaves the country to pay for imports than comes in from exports. It's like a shop that spends much more than it earns, growing poorer year after year. But why is French industry collapsing so quickly? Paradoxically, it's not because of inefficient workers. Hourly productivity remains among the highest in the world. The real problem is the cost of the French system. It's a system weighed down by one of Europe's heaviest tax burdens, charges on companies' assets and workforce even before they make a single euro of profit. This is a massive competitive handicap that, combined with a rigid labour code, has pushed businesses to relocate production abroad. Similar taxes exist in many EU countries, but in France, their level has historically been far higher. This is where industrial decline and financial unsustainability merge into a vicious circle. With a weak industrial base, how can the state afford to fund the highest public spending in the developed world, almost 58% of GDP? The answer reveals the trap. Much of this spending isn't going toward investments in the future, but toward covering the social costs of the present: pensions, healthcare, and welfare benefits. And since taxes, though already sky high, aren't enough to pay for it all, the state is forced to bridge the gap through borrowing, creating a chronic deficit. The French state, therefore, is not borrowing to build the future, but to sustain a present that its real economy can no longer support. It's an engine that has seized up, kept running artificially, not by the fuel of production, but by a constant and unsustainable injection of debt. Yet, if the economic engine has seized, its financial tank is leaking. A massive, constant leak with a clear name: public deficit. This gaping hole in the state's accounts is not a one-off mishap, but a chronic condition. Put simply, every year the French state spends far more than it collects in taxes, creating a gap called the deficit. In recent years, this gap has consistently been about €5.50 for every 100 euros of wealth the country produces. Year after year, these deficits have fed a public debt that is now larger than the entire French economy, topping 110% of national wealth. But the real anomaly emerges when compared to its partners. While Italy and Germany are trying to get their books back in order, France is the only major economy whose budget keeps getting worse. With these numbers, it has earned an uncomfortable distinction. It has become the economy with the highest deficit among all 27 member states of the European Union. So how large exactly is France's public debt? At the start of 2025, it reached the almost incomprehensible sum of €3,345 billion. To make that figure tangible, divide it by every citizen. It amounts to roughly €50,000 of debt for every man, woman, and child in the country. And who holds this mortgage on the future? Unlike other countries such as Italy, whose debt is largely supported by domestic savings, French debt is an international debt. About half of it is in the hands of foreign investors. That makes the French economy particularly exposed and dependent on the confidence of global markets. It is an invisible burden, tied to the moods of the world, with very concrete consequences. But a mountain of debt is not only heavy, it is expensive. With rising interest rates, the cost of servicing that debt has exploded. If 20 years ago this cost was about €30 billion a year, it has now more than doubled. And here, the crisis shows its cruelest face. That figure exceeds the entire budget of the Ministry of National Education. In other words, France spends more to pay interest on its past than it invests in the education of its future. This financial hemorrhage has not gone unnoticed. After a first downgrade in 2024, which lowered France's rating from AA to AA-, the agency, Standard & Poor's, issued a further downgrade on October 17, 2025, bringing the sovereign rating down to A+. This latest action underscores the heightened risks to budgetary consolidation, impeded by severe political instability. That sets off a dangerous spiral. A lower rating means higher interest rates in the future. Higher interest means a larger debt service burden, which in turn makes reducing the deficit even harder. It is no longer a matter of bookkeeping. It is a trap that mortgages France's ability to decide its own future, year after year. But beware, an economic crisis is not measured only in points of GDP or billions of debt. It is also measured in a loss of influence on the world stage. For France, this collapse has taken the shape of an event once unthinkable, almost an economic lèse-majesté. For decades, one of the few certainties on the European scene was a clear hierarchy in which France regarded Italy from a position of undisputed superiority. That hierarchy has now been shattered. According to the International Monetary Fund's projections for 2024 to 2025, Italy has achieved the unimaginable. It has nearly caught up with France in GDP per capita based on purchasing power parity. This isn't just a statistic, it's a psychological shock, the confirmation of a stagnating French economy. This situation is not an isolated incident, but a symptom of eroding influence across the board. The Franco-German engine, for years the political heart of the Union, is now weakened, and France appears more isolated within the European Union. And if the decline is palpable in Brussels, it becomes an open wound on a continent that for a long time symbolized French global prominence: Africa. The humiliating military withdrawals from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are not merely the result of an anti-French sentiment. They are also proof of a nation that no longer has the resources to sustain its role as a power. Russia is exploiting that vacuum, gaining ever greater political and social influence across the Sahel. The overtaking in Europe and the retreat from Africa are not separate events. They are direct consequences of internal economic erosion, of stagnation, deindustrialization, and a debt that limits action. This is a crisis of French status, the painful paradox of a nation with the ambitions and memory of a great power, but with the fragile economy of a country that can no longer afford those ambitions. But as we said at the start, the French crisis is not, unfortunately, only economic. Based on the data, France is experiencing a new and unprecedented wave of crime. The security crisis in France is not an abstract threat, but a daily reality borne out by real numbers. Each year, per 100,000 inhabitants, there are 887 pickpocketings, 771 acts of vandalism, and 656 physical assaults. But this is not a static condition, it is an accelerating crisis. After the enforced lull of the lockdowns, 2022 marked a sharp rise in these offences, in many cases exceeding pre-pandemic levels. What turns these figures into collective anguish is the near certainty of impunity. With clearance rates for residential burglaries between 3% and 7%, over 90% of victims will never see justice. It is this sense of abandonment that feeds fear and turns insecurity from a risk into a way of life. Beneath this first layer lies a darker threshold, that of physical violence. The alarm signal is not only the homicide rate, but the rate of attempted murders, which has doubled over the past 15 years. This brutality wears many faces, from settling of scores with Kalashnikovs that have turned Marseille into a battlefield, to the scourge of femicides, to senseless acts of violence. Added to this is the alarming number of reports of sexual violence, a rate so high that it suggests a deep structural problem within French society. This violence has its epicenters, areas the state itself labels zones of Republican reconquest. There are roughly 1,500 neighbourhoods where poverty and youth unemployment create fertile ground for crime. In Marseille, drug trafficking is an open war fought by teenagers recruited as soldiers. In Seine-Saint-Denis, on the outskirts of Paris, the social fracture erupts in periodic unrest. But who is responsible for this insecurity? The answer is a complex mosaic. Street violence in the big cities is often carried out by very young individuals, frequently unaccompanied foreign minors. Large-scale residential burglaries are the domain of specialized itinerant transnational networks, mainly from Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Then there are the cités, large mass-built public housing estates, often made up of vast concrete blocks and towers built en masse in the suburbs. Here, drug trafficking constitutes a parallel economy run by young French citizens of foreign origin, often second or third generation. To this picture is added the scar of an existential threat: jihadist terrorism. With more than 270 victims in attacks such as the Bataclan and Nice, the country lives under the pressure of a collective trauma. The threat today has changed, carried out by radicalized individuals within those same social fractures that fuel ordinary crime, confirming the diagnosis of an internal disease. All these realities converge in one powerful psychological datum: fear. According to Numbeo, France is the European country whose citizens perceive the highest level of crime. Yet the most revealing statistic is another. Numbeo breaks crime down into several subcategories. France is the only European nation where citizens do not perceive any category of crime as low risk. Fear is pervasive, spreading from the metropolises to small towns. This collective anxiety is the definitive symptom of the crisis. A nation that, statistically and psychologically, no longer feels safe. At this point, we must ask, what is the political response to the economic and criminal crisis France is experiencing? Before we find out, if you found this video informative, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell so you don't miss our new videos. It costs you nothing, and it would greatly help us spread our project. Also remember our new channel, America vs. Europe, where we rank all European countries, the United States and Canada according to various factors. If the economic crisis and the security crisis are the fevers shaking France, the political crisis is the autoimmune disease. The system is attacking itself, paralyzing from within. In October 2025, this institutional crisis proved to be no longer a mere threat, but an implosion in progress. Everything stems from the fragmentation that emerged from the 2022 elections. Since then, France has been partially ungovernable. The National Assembly is split into three hostile blocs: the Presidential Centre, the right-wing Rassemblement National, and the United Left, making it mathematically impossible to form a stable majority. The result is unprecedented instability, with governments that last only a few weeks, as in the record case of Prime Minister Lecornu, who resigned after just 27 days but was later reconfirmed by Macron. Faced with this paralysis, the government has been forced to resort systematically to a controversial constitutional tool, Article 49.3, a weapon that allows the executive to pass a law without the Parliament's final vote. What began as an emergency mechanism has become the symbol of impotence, the inability to govern by consensus. The Republic, designed in 1958 to be strong, is stuck because its institutions were not built to handle this new fragmented reality. But this institutional paralysis did not arise inside the halls of power in a vacuum. It is the direct consequence of a deep fracture that cuts across the entire nation. The split between the France of the corridors of power in Paris and the real country that struggles to make ends meet. This divide is written in the streets. It is the legacy of the Gilets jaunes, the still open wound of the pension reform imposed from above, and the anger of farmers. These are symptoms of chronic disconnect, confirmed by polls. 75% of people in small communes do not feel either heard or understood by the central authorities. This feeling of abandonment is not an abstraction. It is the reality of medical deserts, where you can no longer find a doctor, of post offices that are closing. It is the sound of two Frances that, by now, no longer speak to each other. This disconnection has produced its most logical consequence: the disintegration of the traditional political system. The centre-right and centre-left parties that governed for 50 years are today increasingly in decline in the polls. The landscape is dominated by three blocs offering irreconcilable worldviews. The rise of forces such as the Rassemblement National and La France Insoumise has changed character. It is no longer a protest vote, but a rational adherence to an alternative project by millions of voters who seek, rightly or wrongly, fundamental change. And yet, behind electoral fragmentation and social anger lies the real, deep French crisis, a crisis of vision. The country is stuck because there is no longer consensus on the fundamental questions that define its existence. What is France's place in the world? What model of society does it want to build? What is its national identity? And you will have understood that these questions apply not only to France, but to the entire West, which seems to have lost not only a vision for the future, but also the compass to face today's crises. In the absence of a shared vision, politics has abdicated its role, reducing itself to technical emergency management, a management that, according to the majority of French people, often falls short. This is evidenced by a poll published by Le Figaro at the end of October 2025, which showed the French president's popularity hitting a historic low, with an approval rating of just 11%, the lowest in the last 50 years. And now, it's your turn. We have analysed the 3 fractures testing France. Which one do you think is the most serious? What are the real causes of this situation? And what is the situation in your country? Write it in the comments. Speaking of politicians, we recommend you watch this video, in which we look at the European countries where politicians earn the most. We assure you there will be surprises. That's it for this video. See you next time.